Welcome to another episode of Russian Hate Speech, where we break down the Kremlin's latest lies against the West. On June 20th, 2025, during a special edition of 60 Minutes, Russian military commentator Igor Korotchenko and host Yevgeny Popov promoted dangerous nuclear rhetoric against NATO countries. We must clearly state that in the case of aggression with conventional weapons by any NATO member state, we have the right and will deliver a preemptive strike.
Why only NATO members?
Because NATO surpasses us in military power by 4.5 times. So it must be clearly stated, we love the Finns, but if the Finnish army suddenly invades Karelia, they will receive a tactical nuclear strike on one of their military bases or airfields in Finland.
That aligns with our doctrine.
We must act more harshly and decisively in this matter. This is a stark example of nuclear blackmail, a recurring theme in Russian propaganda. By threatening nuclear strikes even on traditionally neutral nations like Finland, the Kremlin is trying to intimidate Europe and normalize extreme violence as a legitimate political tool. On Evening with Vladimir Solovyov on June 23, 2025, further threats were made. It could happen that next year, during elections, power might change in Hungary or Slovakia, even those relatively friendly to us.
That's fine. We can always use weapons without worrying about entry into territory. That is, we can just go ahead and all of Europe, goodbye.
Here Solovyov makes an overt threat of military invasion and destruction, dismissing all of Europe as expendable. The message is clear. If European nations become less favorable to Moscow, they may be targeted militarily. In the June 24th broadcast of the same program, Solovyov intensified the message calling for Europe to be written off entirely.
We shouldn't even be looking at Europe anymore. Europe should be written off. Diplomatic relations? Pointless. Until Europe comes to its senses, there is no reason to pay it any attention. We should focus on military technical capabilities, study new developments in weapons systems, regardless of where they come from, and rapidly adopt them into our armed forces. We must accept that a confrontation with Europe is inevitable. And maybe we should even consider a preemptive strike based on the speed of technological development.
Solovyov openly suggests the irrelevance of diplomacy and recommends accelerating preparations for war. This represents a shift from rhetoric to justification for future aggression. This segment showcases a complete dismissal of diplomacy and a clear intent to prepare for and even initiate military confrontation with Europe. It highlights Russia's dangerous focus on military solutions over peaceful coexistence. On Sunday Evening with Vladimir Solovyov, aired June 22, 2025, Russian foreign policy expert Andrei Bezrukov pushed the narrative that Europe and the US are planning a surprise attack on Russia.
Today is June 22nd. We all remember what happened on June 22nd. 84 years ago, and we fully understand that now the West, including the United States, is preparing a preemptive strike against us. Whether or not it will be carried out is a political decision, but they are preparing it. And it will be even more insidious and treacherous, using methods we're no longer thinking about. The drone attacks in Iran and on our strategic bases are just examples. I believe they will come up with even more devious tactics to try to eliminate our nuclear triad, which they fear.
By invoking the anniversary of Nazi Germany's attack on the USSR, Bezrukov equates NATO with Hitler's invasion, painting the West as the modern-day existential threat to Russia. This narrative feeds the idea of a defensive war, justifying Russian aggression as preemption. This narrative is a classic disinformation tactic, aiming to create a false pretext for potential Russian aggression by claiming to be acting defensively against an imagined Western preemptive strike. It mirrors historical justifications for military actions. On June 24, 2025, Solovyov made another alarming claim about NATO casualties in Russia's war against Ukraine.
Ask the Poles. Just look at how many cemeteries there are now in Poland. Ask the French, the Germans, the Americans, the British. This war, which NATO supposedly isn't fighting, has already caused more deaths among NATO citizens than the entire NATO death toll in the first and second Iraq campaigns, or the war in Afghanistan, each separately, and in some cases, even combined. How many of their remains are now scattered across the soil of Kursk? And let's not have illusions. Ukrainians really don't like when mercenaries' bodies show up. Often they are disfigured, fingers and heads cut off, so they can't be identified.
This grotesque claim is part of a psychological tactic to frighten Western audiences and deter further support for Ukraine. By inflating casualty numbers and describing alleged mutilations, Solovyov attempts to portray the war as futile and horrifying for the West. By suggesting disfigurement and the removal of body parts to prevent identification, Solovyov aims to dehumanize Ukrainian forces and portray the war as a brutal, senseless slaughter of Western citizens, fabricating a narrative of heavy NATO involvement and losses. Finally, on June 25, 2025, 60 Minutes special edition aired commentary from a senior Russian politician framing European militarization as a threat to Russia and a reason to block Ukraine's EU ambitions. If the trend of transforming the European Union into a military political bloc, fighting against Russia continues, then, of course, we will categorically oppose any participation of any remnants of Ukraine in a military political bloc that sees our country as its main enemy. I think everyone should take that into account. This statement makes it clear Russia sees EU defense integration not just as a threat but as justification to interfere in Ukraine's future. The Kremlin views Ukraine's European aspirations not as sovereign choices, but as provocations. These segments illustrate the Kremlin's escalating hostility toward Europe, the normalization of nuclear threats, and its ongoing attempts to divide and intimidate the West. Thank you for joining us today. Stay tuned for the next episode of Russian Hate Speech as we continue exposing the Kremlin's war on reality.